Hi friends, happy March. We are embarking on a new month in our journey through different character traits that are valued at Earl Warren Elementary. And boy, we've talked about a lot of neat ones. Kindness and optimism and generosity and gratitude, to name a few. And this month, we're talking about one that I think is maybe a little bit trickier to understand. This month's character trait is integrity. Do you know what that word means? Stop for a minute and ask your friends if they know what that means. Anybody? Well, there is one definition that I hear often when people talk about integrity. And they say that integrity means doing the right thing even when no one is watching. And I think that that's partially true. But I think that integrity is a lot more than that. Integrity isn't just about doing things. Having integrity is about being someone. And I think that it's about being the same person in private and in public, or being the same person on the inside and on the outside. Now, that might not have cleared things up for you very well yet, but I think that today's book might just help us. We are going to read an old classic book called Ferdinand. Now, some of you may have seen the movie, but I have to say, the movie was not as good as the book. And in fact, the movie almost had an entirely different message than the book did. So I am a big fan of the book. And our main character is a bull named Ferdinand. And what I want you to watch for and listen for as we read the book together is how Ferdinand stays the same on the inside, even when those on the outside are perhaps expecting something different from him. And then after we read about Ferdinand, we're going to come back and draw a scene from this book. But instead of putting Ferdinand in the middle, we might just put ourselves there. So join me as we read along. The Story of Ferdinand by Munro Leaf. Drawings by Robert Lawson. The Story of Ferdinand. Once upon a time, in Spain, there was a little bull, and his name was Ferdinand. All the other little bulls he lived with would run and jump and butt their heads together. But not Ferdinand. He liked to sit just quietly and smell the flowers. He had a favorite spot out in the pasture under a cork tree. It was his favorite tree, and he would sit in its shade all day and smell the flowers. Sometimes his mother, who was a cow, would worry about him. She was afraid he would be lonesome all by himself. "Why don't you run and play with the other little bulls and skip and butt your head?" she would say. But Ferdinand would shake his head. "I like it better here, where I can just sit quietly and smell the flowers." His mother saw that he was not lonesome, and because she was an understanding mother, even though she was just a cow, she let him just sit there and be happy. As the years went by, Ferdinand grew and grew until he was very big and strong. All the other bulls who had grown up with him in the same pasture would fight each other all day. They would butt each other and stick each other with their horns. What they wanted most of all was to be picked to fight at the bullfights in Madrid. But not Ferdinand. He still liked to sit just quietly under the cork tree and smell the flowers. One day, 5 men came in very funny hats to pick the biggest, fastest, roughest bull to fight the bullfights in Madrid. All the other bulls ran around snorting and butting, leaping and jumping, so the men would think that they were very, very strong and fierce and pick them. Ferdinand knew that they wouldn't pick him, and he didn't care. So he went out to his favorite cork tree to sit down. He didn't look where he was sitting, and instead of sitting on the nice cool grass in the shade, he sat on a bumblebee. Well, if you were a bumblebee and a bull sat on you, what would you do? You would just sting him, and that is what the bee did to Ferdinand. Wow, did it hurt! Ferdinand jumped up with a snort. He ran around puffing and snorting, butting and pawing the ground as if he were crazy. The 5 men saw him, and they shouted with joy. Here was the largest and fiercest bull of all. Just the one for the bullfights in Madrid. So they took him away for the bullfight day in a cart. What a day it was. Flags were flying, bands were playing, and all the lovely ladies had flowers in their hair. They had a parade into the bullring. First came the banderilleros with long, sharp pins with ribbons on them to stick in the bull and make him mad. Next came the picadores, who rode skinny horses, and they had long spears to stick in the bull and make him madder. Then came the matador, the proudest of all. He thought he was very handsome and bowed to the ladies. He had a red cape and a sword and was supposed to stick the bull last of all. Then came the bull. And you know who that was, don't you? Ferdinand. They called him Ferdinand the Fierce, and all the banderilleros were afraid of him, and the picadores were afraid of him, and the matador was scared stiff. Ferdinand ran to the middle of the ring, and everyone shouted and clapped because they thought he was going to fight fiercely and butt and snort and stick his horns around. But not Ferdinand. When he got to the middle of the ring, he saw the flowers in all the lovely ladies' hair, and he just sat down quietly and smelled. He wouldn't fight and be fierce no matter what they did. He just sat and smelled. And the banderilleros were mad, and the picadores were madder, and the matador was so mad he cried because he couldn't show off with his cape and sword. So they had to take Ferdinand home. And for all I know, he's sitting there still, under his favorite cork tree, smelling the flowers just quietly. He is very happy. Don't you love Ferdinand? Ferdinand was Ferdinand, whether he was sitting under his cork tree or being hauled off in a cart or in the middle of a bull ring in the capital city of Madrid. Ferdinand knew who he was, and he behaved that way no matter what those around him expected. I just love this book. And I wonder if sometimes we feel a little bit like Ferdinand too. We feel like we're a certain way on the inside, but people want us to be different, or expect us to be different, or demand us to be different. Or maybe we think they do, and we're tempted to change. But Ferdinand, he just stayed Ferdinand. He had integrity. And there's one scene in the book, a very, very simple illustration that I think shows this idea of integrity more than any others. It's this one. Notice Ferdinand. Where's he sitting? In the middle of the bull ring, right? And everybody around him, the banderilleros and the picadores and the matador, they all want him to fight. Everybody in the crowd wants him to fight. Everybody has shown up because they want him to be fierce and tough and brave and strong. But Ferdinand knows he's not like that. And instead, he chooses to just be who he is. In spite of all of the crowd roaring and expecting, Ferdinand stays who he is. And I want you to be able to stay who you are too. That's part of having integrity, is being who you are, no matter what the crowd says that you should be. And so I thought today in our journals that we could recreate this picture of Ferdinand in the bull ring, but we're going to do it while imagining some things. I'm going to teach you how to draw Ferdinand. It's not as complicated as it looks. Like we've done in so many other lessons, we're going to break it down into simple shapes. But as we draw Ferdinand, I want you to think about how you are. Who are you on the inside? Are you brave? Are you shy? Are you athletic? Are you artistic? Are you adventurous? Are you timid? Are you academic? Or maybe a combination of all of those things. But I want you to just imagine who you are. Who would you be sitting in that bull ring? And then we're going to draw the stadium and the crowd. And as we draw those very simple circles to represent the crowd, I'm going to ask you to think about what other people might think you are. Now you'll be able to draw the circles or maybe even write some of those words in your stadium as we think about what it means to have integrity and be who we are, no matter what others think. So all you'll need today is your journal and a pencil. If you want, I used a black pen on top of my pencil. You can get that, but you can also just leave it in pencil if you want. So go ahead and grab your supplies and let's draw together. All right, here's our inspiration photo, or inspiration piece from our book today. And we're going to draw Ferdinand just a little bit bigger because it's kind of hard to draw a teeny tiny little cow. But let's go ahead. You can open up to a blank page in your journal, and we're going to go ahead and draw the wall of the stadium just so we know that we have space for Ferdinand. We're going to draw the wall up in the upper third of our journal this morning. And if you notice with me, it's just a very gentle curve, an arc. This is a round stadium, and so it would go all the way around, and we're just seeing a portion of that wall right there. So I'm going to do an invisible drawing with my finger to make that plan. Just up. I'm going to just do that curve so that my brain can imagine where that curve is going to go. Now I'm going to take my pencil, and remember, this doesn't have to be perfect. We're just going to make a little curve at the top. Sometimes when I'm drawing with a pencil, I might go back and forth a couple times till I get a curve that I really like. And then I can always go back and erase the parts that I don't like. Aren't erasers amazing gifts? So I've got my little curve there, and I'll do another little curve right above it. A parallel line, that means that those two lines are going to keep going in the same direction and they'll never cross. And that will be our wall. We're going to leave that upper part empty for a later part of the exercise. And now we're going to draw Ferdinand right here in the middle. I'm going to zoom in on Ferdinand for just a minute so that we can examine some of the shapes. Because you remember, when we're trying to draw something that we see, it's often best to break it down into simple shapes. So let's get really close to Ferdinand here. Okay. Now when you see Ferdinand, I want you to squint your eyes until he's just kind of a blob on the screen. And if you saw that blob and somebody said, "What shape is that?" what would you say? You can even shout it out. Did you say a circle? No, I don't see these. He's not a circle. Is he a square with four corners? Not really. If you see what I see when I squint my eyes, I see that Ferdinand is quite the triangle. And so when we draw Ferdinand, we're going to start by drawing that triangle. And then I noticed that Ferdinand's face is a teeny tiny triangle going the other direction. Even his front leg is a bit of a triangle coming down. And then I see some other shapes. I see an oval. I see a bit of a circle where his belly is. I see more ovals or semicircles in the legs. So we're going to just start with the big shapes and make smaller shapes as we go as we draw our own Ferdinand. So let me zoom back out. There we go. And let's start by drawing our big triangle for Ferdinand. I'm going to do my invisible drawing to plan where I'm going to put Ferdinand, and I'm going to put him right about here. Now, as we draw, I want you to just be thinking in your mind, if I were Ferdinand, what would I be thinking in this situation? Would I be content to just sit and smell the flowers? Would I be content to just be me? Go ahead and do an invisible drawing of a triangle where you want to put Ferdinand and ask yourself those questions. Would I be content to just sit? Would I be content to just be me? All right, let's draw that triangle. Now I'm going to sketch this very lightly. I will press a little bit harder on my paper so you can see it on the camera, but feel free to just do a very light sketch of a triangle in the middle of your paper. You might say, "Mrs. Berg, that does not look like a cow." And you're right. It doesn't look like a cow yet, but let's keep going. Now we notice that his face also looks like a triangle that points up and to the right. So I'm going to make another little triangle up and to the right for his face. That looks more like a penguin than a cow right now, but it will look like a cow if we keep going. All right, now let's take a peek at these big long horns that everybody expected to be used as weapons. Ferdinand didn't want to do that. They're just triangles with a little curve to them, aren't they? So I'm going to do those next. I'm going to make those two triangles with a little curve, like little half moons. Now let's look at, we've got our big basic shapes, don't we? We've got that big triangle for the body, we've got that triangle for the face, and we've got the horns like that. So now let's break it down into some of the smaller shapes. We talked about how this leg is like a triangle, didn't we? About halfway down the body is where it starts. So we'll come about halfway down the body of the triangle, and let's do that big long triangle of a leg like that. Starting to take shape a little bit, isn't it? Now let's look at the legs. We have a semicircle right here. So let's draw that leg right here. See how that comes up and over and down and then is flat? Let's do that like this. Up and over and down and flat. Then we have this other leg, and it's a little bit of an oval. So let's do that oval over here. A bit of an oval. Then the way that the front legs are, they're more little semicircles, aren't they? So let's make a semicircle and another semicircle. Starting to look a little bit more like Ferdinand. But it wouldn't look like Ferdinand without this awesome bull belly. So let's make this part of our triangle a little bit rounder. Let's add that Ferdinand belly. Okay, it's coming, it's coming. Let's zoom in on this face for a minute. Let's scoot this over. What shapes do we see in the face? Well, we see that the face isn't just a triangle, but it has some curves too. That we have a little U or a half semicircle right there, and the end of our nose is like a backwards C, isn't it? So let's come over to our triangle here and see if we can get those shapes on Ferdinand's face. So starting at the base of this triangle, we're going to make a U, and then we're going to make this end of the triangle that backwards C. Now we're talking. Now we're looking a lot more like Ferdinand, aren't we? I love Ferdinand's eyelashes. We don't think of a bull as having eyelashes, but if you've ever seen a cow in person, you'll notice that they have big eyelashes. It's so hard, isn't it, to see this teeny tiny little bull. Let's zoom way back in. There we go. You can see Ferdinand's eyelashes are another little U as he looks up and smells the flowers. His ear is a V on its side. Do you see that right there? So let's go ahead and draw that little V on its side. And now we can go and just add some of the details. Now I'll notice that the back of his body, that triangle kind of comes in. So this is where we get to start changing our shapes a little bit and making some of our lines darker. I'm going to take the point off of that triangle and I'm going to add a tail, just a little wiggly line. Then I'm going to come back to this triangle, this front leg of his, and I'm going to add a hoof at the bottom. And I'm going to give him a shoulder. Add a spot. He has that little black spot right there. And then I'm just going to trace around the lines that I had and color some of them in. Now remember when we've talked about cross-hatching? You all remember cross-hatching. We've done that a couple of times. The first time was with where the wild things are. Do you remember how we did lines and then went back over them to make shading? Well, we can do that on our Ferdinand picture right here. You might add a little nostril up here. You can keep your Ferdinand as detailed or as simple as you want. Feel free to erase lines, to add things like hooves, to add some fur. Ferdinand has a little bit of fur showing. He has a lot of cross-hatching back here. But just keep playing around with your Ferdinand until you get him looking like you'd like him to. I'm always looking back, always observing my inspiration picture and coming back to make it look even a little bit more like that first piece. But I think that does a pretty good Ferdinand. Now, feel free to pause the video here if you want, and to keep working on your Ferdinand until you get him looking just like you want. You could even go back and trace over him with a black marker, or you can just leave it as it is. The last part of the Ferdinand piece of our picture is this part right here. What is that? That's right, that's his shadow. He must be sitting, the sun must be over here shining on him, and he's casting a shadow behind him. That doesn't have to be fancy. Our artist just used little tiny dashes in a shape similar to Ferdinand's body to show that he's seated right here on the ground and not floating in space. So I'm going to just make some dashes, remembering that his body was a triangle, and then his head was a little triangle, and his horns were little triangles. And those little dashes will make a shadow behind Ferdinand. If you look closely, you'll see that there's also a bit of a shadow under Ferdinand, because he's sitting right there on the ground. And that helps us to ground our picture too when we add that shadow. So I'm going to just add a little bit of those shadow marks under Ferdinand here. Well, Ferdinand looks quite content to be who he is where he is in spite of the crowd. And now we're going to move to our crowd. Now this part is not hard art at all. In fact, this part is art that is more about what we think on the inside than what we do on the outside with our hands. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to remember the story and all of the different characters that had opinions about Ferdinand. The first character that had an opinion was Ferdinand's mom. And Ferdinand's mom didn't understand Ferdinand at first, but then she decided to let him be exactly like he was. So I want you to think of somebody in your life who lets you be exactly like you are. And I just want you to draw little circles while you think about that person. You might think about a time that they encouraged you, or stood up for you, or understood you. But just think about that person. Is it your mom, your grandma, your teacher, a friend? Maybe it's your pet. Maybe it's another adult in your life, or a cousin. Who understands you and likes you just the way you are? That's part of your crowd. Now let's go to the next layer of the crowd, and I want you to think about the other bulls in the story. They were very different from Ferdinand. They were fierce and brave and rough and tumble, and Ferdinand might have felt kind of funny around them. Or maybe they didn't understand why Ferdinand was the way he was. So I want you to now think about somebody who maybe doesn't understand you. Somebody who's very different from you. Maybe somebody who thinks that you should be different. Or somebody that you think maybe you should be like. Maybe Ferdinand looked at those bulls and was tempted to think, why am I not like them? Notice, I don't care if my circles are perfect or touching or overlapping or anything. I'm just using this space to think about the people who are different from me, and maybe how I've thought about them in the past. All right, now let's think about the third group. The third group were the banderilleros and the picadores and the maladores, the ones who expected Ferdinand to be a certain way and they were very disappointed when he was not who they thought he was. Have you ever had anybody like that in your life? Somebody who wanted you to be a certain way, who got angry when you weren't a certain way, who expected you to be something that you're not? You can go ahead and draw some circles while you think about that person or those people. Maybe it's somebody on the playground very different from you. Maybe you look at them and wonder why you're not like them. Or maybe they look at you and wonder why are you like you. We all have people like that. And by this time, your crowd might be pretty full. But guess what? When you look at your journal page, is this the part that you notice? Or is this the part that you notice? It's this part, right? Because this is the part that matters. Not what everybody thinks or what everybody expects, but that you are content being you. I hope you had fun exploring Ferdinand. And I hope that when you think of this word integrity, that drawing this picture might come to mind. That you can remember that having integrity is being who you are, no matter what the crowd says. Well, I know that many of you have so much integrity. And I also know that you're all very unique and very special. And I want you to be proud to be who you are. I know I'm proud to be your teacher. And I sure love it when we get to draw together, even when we're apart.